This is the Comics Alternative, on location at Heroes Aren't Hard to Find in Charlotte, North Carolina. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative on location. I am, as I usually am on these shows, at Heroes Aren't Hard to Find. They're located at 417 Pecan Avenue in Charlotte, North Carolina. If you're in the area, please come by. Heroes Aren't Hard to Find. And in fact, if you're not in the area, then next time you're in the Carolinas, make it a point to come to Heroes Aren't Hard to Find. And this is our April On Location episode, and as fate would have it, the date that I wanted to come in and do this month's On Location show, and today is the 11th of April, happened to be the same date that a professor at a local university, Queens University, wanted to bring his class into Heroes for various reasons. And I know this professor, he's a friend, Michael Kobre, and I asked him, hey, would you maybe have your students talk with us a bit about what they were learning in that class of yours? So I've got a table of a lot of people here, so this is going to be fun. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Mike, if you can just introduce the class, what you're doing, and why you brought a group of people here to Heroes.
Sure. Well, thanks, Derek. This is a class. It is an English class, as we have redefined the discipline of English over the last decade or so. And the focus of the class is diversity in popular culture. The title of the class is Secret Identities, a phrase that, from the comics, of course, that has a lot of poetic and cultural resonance. And it's Secret Identities, Diversity in Popular Culture. We've looked in passing at Hollywood films and the emergence of rock and roll music in the 1950s, but our primary focus has been the development of the American comic book industry, an industry established by first-generation Jewish Americans, one of many forms of almost outsider art that was created by people coming from very diverse backgrounds outside of the mainstream of American society, and these guys have had a crash course in that. We've looked at the development of the particular medium of the American comic book, and it seemed natural to bring them on a field trip to Heroes, so we're happy to be here.
Great. So now, your professor was telling me before we started recording that out of a class of, 12? Mm-hmm. Only 2 of you have been in a comic shop before. Now, I'm not going to ask, who were those 2, but I find that an interesting number. So I'm curious, both from a professor's and also a student's point of view, why the shop? What do you want to get out of it? Why did you come here? And are you going to get extra credit?
Oh, put me on the spot. Thanks a lot for that.
So I'll take that.
Yeah.
So one of the things...
and by the way, your name is?
Mitchell Wallace.
Mitch, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, too. Thanks for having us out. Mm-hmm. We appreciate it. One of the things Professor Kobre did not tell us or teach us is how to speak as clear as you guys do. So I don't have that radio voice, but I'm going to give it a try. But I was just it's just fascinating when he said that there was, a place in Charlotte that has... the things that we were talking about in class. I'm a native, been here all my life, and I never even knew about it. So, that just speaks volumes that a lot of people may be interested in knowing that you guys are here. And, so for me, I just wanted to come and see for myself what you guys had have in here. And it looks like you have quite a bit of, interesting things, even some of the things that we talked about in class. So the takeaway for me is to kind of look around a little bit and learn a little bit more about, comics from other perspective other than in the class, and take that out and utilize it for my own personal use.
Okay.
My name is Aspen Payne. I've always been really interested in superheroes, but I've never really been into comics by the time I was old enough to really appreciate superheroes. The movies and TV shows were a lot more popular. So when I got the opportunity to come here, I've never been in a comic book store, and it's interesting to be surrounded by all these stories, a lot of them much more original and older, the stories, than what I've been exposed to in a lot of the more mainstream forms of media.
Well, that's interesting because, you mentioned other media outside of comics. If someone doesn't read comics, but they're aware of, let's say, various facets of comics culture, for instance, the superhero movies, then a place like this becomes enlightening because these kind of shops is where you're going to get the mainstream titles that make their way into television and film, as opposed to, let's say, other bookstores like Barnes & Noble and whatnot, who may carry DC, Marvel, other mainstream material, but would also probably tend to privilege what one could loosely call, I still don't like this phrase, graphic novels, which, you can find here all around us as well. But at a comic shop, you have individual issues that come out every week of the comic books. A comic book as a comic book, not a book with a spine necessarily. And that's where a lot of the TV and film has been generated from.
Hi, my name is Nia Mira. I was actually brought into the kind of like being a fan of comic books and comic book heroes from the Marvel movies and the Marvel TV shows. I kind of saw them almost as like a teaser because I knew that there was so much more grounded history behind all these heroes. And so being in a place like this is really enlightening. It's very nice because you get to see some more of the history behind these heroes. And I was actually just looking at one of the issues of Black Panther, and I was considering buying it, but I realized that it wasn't one of the more recent Ta-Nehisi Coates runs, which is, I've actually read a couple of those, and that's probably my favorite run of Black Panther that I've seen so far. And so it's really interesting to see these different artists and these different authors in the different comic books.
So my name is Shannon. It's a little weird. I listen to like hundreds of podcasts. Never thought I'd be on one. So I wanted to take this class. We all have kind of, to coin a term, or not coin a term, but use a term, our origin stories when it comes to comics. I only started reading comics a few years ago, actually due to my husband. Thanks, husband. Who is a huge comic book reader, specifically superheroes, DC, Marvel, all of it. And I got really interested in it. And I became a comic book reader, not so much for the superheroes, but and I have no idea if it has like a genre title, but I like the stories like Saga and Paper Girls, Lumberjanes, still the fantastical, but less the superheroes. And so, I think I'm kind of like an oddball. I have an English degree. I'm taking this class for fun because I never had the opportunity to quite take a class like this where I get to analyze and observe comics from a literary standpoint. So it's definitely been enlightening, and I enjoy coming to comic book stores because it's the same as going to any bookstore, browsing and finding new titles. I already found like 8 new titles that I will probably end up buying tonight. So yeah, it's just something I'm genuinely interested in.
Well, I'm sure the people at the shop like to hear this.
Yes.
Hey, we're going to buy some comics.
Expect me later.
I think one of the things that we've also tried to do in the class, certainly was my intention, is not only look at this in the history of the medium and how that medium reflects and is a product of American diversity, but as sort of one of the underlying goals of the class was also to think about how do we read comics? How does the form work? How do we look at the page? How do we look at the movement from one panel to another? I always think of a line from Art Spiegelman in an interview with NPR around the time one of the volumes of Mouse was published, where he said, in our education, we're taught how to read things, but we're not taught how to look at things. And so one of the goals of the class, whenever I teach comics, is let's just look at the page. What are we seeing happening on the page? How is our eye being moved from one panel to another? How does the design of the page work? And once you start seeing those things, then you see them everywhere.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting because if you know anything about studying like the Bible, for instance, you have hermeneutics which is kind of gives you a background of what's going on. So with comics and, learning how to look at the pictures, as a kid, I just saw the pictures and I thought I was Superman, Didn't really mean anything to me just by looking at it other than the image itself. But now looking, taking this class and learning how the frame works and how everything is kind of like spaced in there for a specific reason, it's been an eye-opener for me as well. So it's very interesting. This class has really taught me a lot of different things.
It's good to hear that in your class you're emphasizing the visuals as much as, I guess, what we would call the more literary aspects of comics. And I think that, my background, very similar to yours, in English literary studies, I always, whenever I teach comics, have to check myself and say, don't just approach it as literature. Don't treat it the same way that you would a short story or a novel in the more traditional sense, because they're the visuals that are doing some storytelling, but they're doing a lot more of that as well. So, which is interesting. And Mike, I didn't ask you this the other day. We were talking last week, kind of preparing for what we're going to do this. Have you read the relatively recent book by Paul Karasik and Mark Newgarden, How to Read Nancy?
I have not, but Andy Mansell here in the shop was just talking to me about that, and I've heard great things about it. So that's on my list, and that is about responding to this as a visual medium. Is that correct?
Yeah. And in fact, I mentioned this because right before we started the recording, I was talking with Andy, who is standing right here, about this book. And I don't know, maybe something at Heroes Con this year will come of this. Who knows? Am I tipping my hat? Should I not?
Let's hope. I think that there'd be, it's. I think it's the future. One of the important books that will hopefully maybe one day become a textbook and also on every shelf of every budding cartoonist.
It is. It's definitely a teachable text when it comes to how the visuals work on a very simple 3-panel strip, and that's it. So it's something that you could use in the classroom. It's something that people who create comics themselves can learn a lot from. And as fate would have it, when this episode that we're recording right now goes up, which will be on Friday the 13th. Oh, it's the 13th. Jeez. I just realized that. The previous day, which is tomorrow as we record this, I will have published an interview with Paul Karasik and Mark Newgarden about How to Read Nancy. It is a fascinating book, and I think I saw a copy of it here somewhere, maybe. So you guys definitely want to check it out, and it's worth getting. From Heroes, of course.
Of course.
And we've had a teaser trailer for a convention panel, too, so it's very exciting.
Yeah. You get everything here. So you have the other students in class who are kind of, I don't know, shy, kind of waiting for their turn in the seat, or hovering in a way that may or may not be menacing. I'm not sure.
Anybody want to come over and sit down and join the conversation?
Okay, no pressures.
I'll take their extra credit.
The students are always negotiating for extra credit.
And hello.
Hello.
So you're in the class.
I am.
Okay. Or had you been in a comic shop before?
I've been a couple of times at the one near my house, but mainly just for my brother.
Oh,
Not
okay.
really for me.
So you're one of the two in class who have stepped into a comic shop before.
Yes.
Okay. So, I mean, maybe I can ask you and the others as well. What are you learning in this class, specifically, I guess, about comics or comics culture, or how comics informs culture, and then vice versa, that seems completely new to you? You say, I didn't even think about that before I take the class.
To me, it was mind-blowing, just the history behind comics. I had no idea that some of the main first comic book writers were like Jewish Americans. They changed their names. I found that really fascinating, and it was nice to be able to have those fascinating facts so that when my family was like, oh, you don't know what this superhero does? I'm like, but did you know that Stan Lee's real name is not Stan Lee? And they're like, what? Mm-hmm. So it's been really interesting just learning the background history and learning through comics.
What about the rest of you? What are you like? Your name is?
My name is Ben Ruiz.
Ben. And so, what are you learning, or have you learned? Because we're at the end of the semester, I guess, in class that you were clueless about in terms of comics before.
Well, one of my big dream is to one day write for DC Comics, and so I've actually read a great deal of comics, and am familiar with myself with the history of it, and I wanted to see how taking this class could change any perspectives that I had, and honestly, it helped me realize how much culture like today influences what is in comics, how there's much more acceptance now, and that leads to more diversity in comics, and that's something that I'm learning that's really amazing to me, and that's something that I think no one finishes learning, really, because there's always something new to incorporate.
Have you written a script, or at least the beginnings of a script before?
I have, actually.
Oh,
yes.
Okay. Shown it around?
I've mainly kept it to myself. I've shown it to one or two other people that have given me a little bit of criticism in terms of what I could improve or what works well and what to change. But I definitely look forward to giving it more time, especially now that the semester is winding down.
And so you feel that, having taken the class, you're more aware of how various cultural issues inform what goes into the writing, that a particular story, superhero or otherwise, is not created in a vacuum. That even though it may not seem to be dealing with certain socio-political, historical issues on the surface, that if you look a little closer, it's there.
Exactly. That's something that I definitely want to incorporate into the stories that I write, and is something that I always find a way to really make either an integral part of the plot or to just have there so that people know.
Okay.
Yeah, one of the things we focused on in the class has been certainly with characters like Superman, Clark Kent, Steve Rogers, Captain America, how these are disguised stories of developing an American identity, of immigrants wanting to become American in that way. So that's one way into the whole subject. I put Ben on the spot in class because he's one of the comic book fans. So today he had to explain what a legacy hero was. And then we got into the weeds of talking about Terrigen Mists and the Inhumans and the copyright struggle over who owns the X-Men for movie adaptations. So this is one of the dangers of this class, that you wander into those areas.
So you were getting into the weeds.
Yes, I was.
Wow.
I took them all with me too, and they've lived to tell the tale.
Did anyone, you or one of the students, bring up the television series Inhumans?
We did not. No, I think that's probably better forgotten.
Yes.
From what I hear about
yes. I watched the pilot, or I guess the very first episode, and I thought it was going to be an hour, and it was a really long hour, and then not quite halfway through, there was a commercial, and I got the sense that there was another hour after that. It's like, oh, my God. And I shut the TV off. I can't watch anymore. It wasn't that engaging, let's just say.
Yeah, our focus in class tonight was the first volume of G. Willow Wilson's Ms. Marvel, G. Willow Wilson and Adrian Alphona, and that was a nice way to kind of bring the story of diversity and popular culture up to a relatively contemporary moment.
So are you going to teach a course, this particular course, or a course like this in the semesters to come?
Absolutely, yeah. It will, as courses always do, they tend to evolve, and it's not quite the same organization of texts, but I will absolutely be doing this. There seems to be an interest in it. Our primary text this semester that we use to kind of get a sense of the history of the medium, and also deal with those issues of diversity, was Michael Chabon's novel, The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay.
What did you guys think of that novel?
Outstanding.
Fabulous. One of the best things I've ever read.
Oh,
honestly.
Wow.
I really enjoyed it, both from a person who just generally enjoys novels, and also someone who is starting to get more into comic books. I liked being able to see the story of comic books in a novelization sort of way. That kind of helped me in a way, understand the history better than just talking about it or seeing it in a textbook would. And it kind of made me more emotionally involved with the characters. Yeah.
But it's also a distressingly well-written novel. I would like Michael Chabon to just write a couple of bad sentences for once in his life.
Were you guys familiar with Chabon before? Had you ever seen the film Wonder Boys?
No.
Oh, okay.
Stoner.
Because I mean I think that was the novel that put him on the map.
Yeah.
I mean, it was Amazing Adventures that got him the Pulitzer, and really solidified his career, at least as it relates to comics. And I find it interesting that when it comes to the crossroads of comics and literature, especially contemporary literature, he's the touchstone. He's the one that everybody goes to, and that's specifically that novel, Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay.
Yeah, I think that's a great breakthrough. There's the work of Jonathan Lethem also in a book like Fortress of Solitude.
Yeah.
For anybody who's interested, check out some of Chabon's essays. You can find online a fabulous essay that he wrote for the fashion issue of The New Yorker on superhero costumes. It's an essay called Secret Skin. It's not available in any of his collections, but it's worth checking out. One of the best explorations of the visual iconography of superheroes that's available anywhere.
I did not know that. And is it collected in what book of his?
It's not collected in any of the books.
It's not. It's not in like a collection of essays?
Sure. Chabon has two collections of essays. One is Imaginary Homelands, and the other is Manhood for Amateurs. Both of them have include essays about comics. But for whatever reason, Secret Skin has never been collected anywhere, and it's certainly worth checking out.
It's been a long time since I've read Chabon.
Worth going back to.
I think the last thing of his that I read was Gentleman of the Road.
Sure.
Did I get the title correct?
You did indeed. Yeah.
And that was a book that was originally serialized in the New York Times Magazine.
Sure, yeah. With illustrations by Gary Gianni, comic book artist, and Prince Valiant, absolutely, sure. And The Monster Men, which was in the back of Hellboy, I believe. Yeah. We're going in the weeds again.
Can I ask a question?
What I was just going to say. I mean, you're here hovering in the background. Mike, Andy, take a mic.
No. Well, no. Please sit because I want to hear your answers. This is here.
And the individual you are hearing now is Andy Mansell, and I've known him for several years. He really organizes the panels at Heroes Con every year, and so it's thanks to him that I've been a part of certain panels in the past. So anyway,
thank you.
That's the context of the speaker.
All right, I appreciate it, and thank you. And here's the question for you. I think it's so important, and I want to hear from people that are a generation or two younger than me, and also people that are coming into comics maybe perhaps a little bit later. And I'm going to preface it for a second, but I'll stay focused. Every 10 years, they remake Three Musketeers. And all us old farts go, oh, that stinks. It's not like the Gene Kelly version. It's too smart alecky. And then before you know it, people are watching it. It suddenly captured a new generation. Same thing happens with King Arthur, for good or bad. Pretty much all of the archetypes. So my question for you guys is this. It used to be, hey, the comic book started in 1960. The thing that everybody loved about Marvel Comics more than anything was that it was all happening in this world and everything had to be explained. And if it wasn't, it was a no prize. Then finally they got fed up and they said, no, we're going to kickstart it every couple of years. Some people hate it. Some people love it. Now they're doing it with the movies. To me, being an old guy, I should not like that, but it's starting to make more and more sense. And I think it's something that makes the storytelling more dynamic. To you guys, does it make you crazy? Does it not matter? Or, shut up, Andy.
I think it's a little bit of both. It certainly, when we read Ms. Marvel, I was very, very lost because I had never heard of Ms. Marvel or Captain Marvel before. But hearing you talk about it, it reminds me very much of Shakespeare and how his plays are being remade constantly in different aspects and under different circumstances. And it changes the story, but I think it also offers a very unique insight into the particular author's perspective and how they see the world and what they're choosing to show us. And I think that's one thing that's very unique about the comic book industry that I didn't really appreciate until this class. I'd never really realized how different some of these stories were, even though they were about the same character. I thought it was very, very fascinating to learn about.
Would it make you, just real quick, because this is a back to follow the question, then would you, if they made the Ms. Marvel movie, okay, and it was completely and utterly different, or even better, it was exactly the same and you liked it, but then you turned around in a couple of years and suddenly there's a new Ms. Marvel, would you be compelled to want to check it out, or would you sit there and go, wait, this isn't the Ms. Marvel that I knew?
I think before taking this class, I would have probably shunned it because it wouldn't have been familiar to me, but after taking this class, I really enjoy seeing how different people are taking a very similar story or the same character and taking it in a completely different way, and I think it's shown me a very unique perspective on what you can do with characters and stories and how you can keep going, and it's not, you can tell a different story and it not be about a different thing necessarily.
There's a great phrase in a terrific collection of essays on comics called Let's Hear It for the Atom Smashers, which is creative writers on comics. It was edited by a guy named Sean Howe, who also wrote a book chronicling the history of Marvel Comics. And in the introduction to that, and he's basically talking about mainstream comics, those published by Marvel and DC, and he refers to them as ongoing narrative machines. And I think one of the things that's really interesting to me as a scholar and as a teacher about mainstream comics, characters who are commercial properties, who have to be kept in reasonably good shape so that they can be franchised and made into new movies and new toys, is the way that the demands of working within that particular narrative form with characters who've existed for 70, 80 years almost, that creates a whole new set of demands for creators. And that can be a source of frustration when everything is rebooted and changed. But it can also be exciting to see the way new aspects of the character and new aspects of the situation can be discovered. And a final thing, we talked about this tonight in class, that in terms of mainstream pop culture, it has made the comic book industry perhaps the most, let me throw around some fancy critical terms, postmodern, self-reflexive popular forms that exist, with so many stories that are depending on the knowledge the reader brings of having read other stories about that character or other stories in that genre and that tradition. And that's, for me as a scholar, that's a fascinating aspect of this whole dimension of pop culture.
I cut her off. I'm sorry, you were going to say.
Mine's actually kind of related to what you were saying about the reboot kind of bringing out new aspects of characters. I think it's really important with Marvel trying to insert more diversity that they do this, because it gives different creators with a different background an opportunity to take over characters and represent different cultures and different races accurately and appropriately. One really good example of that is the new Ta-Nehisi Coates run of Black Panther. I think it's really important that this character that was created by two Jewish immigrants is now being taken over by a Black creator, so that he is now able to more accurately express more of the Black community's experience within these comic books, which is something really important to me as an African American woman, having my stories and my culture represented accurately.
Yeah, I think that's one of the really fascinating things about, again, the history of sort of mainstream comics, is how a character like Black Panther, created by Jacob Kurtzberg, a.k.a. Jack Kirby, and Stanley Lieber, a.k.a. Stan Lee, is created first by first-generation Jewish Americans, and within the form of popular storytelling with characters who are commercial properties, how those characters can then be taken up, how the mythology can be expanded upon by other creators later down the line. And when we get into areas of diversity, as with a character like Black Panther, you add a whole other sort of fascination there. All of this kind of reinforces one of the main points of the class, that the great things about American culture, the great things about our popular culture. The comic book medium is one example of that, but popular music and film being other examples, is that our achievements in American culture come directly from our diversity. However much we might want to shun that diversity and say that's not who we've always been, that's American history and that's American culture.
Hear, hear.
Sort of adding on to that, one thing that when I started reading, my favorite thing to read was The Flash, and he continues to be my favorite superhero. And when I started reading, it was Wally West. He was the Flash, and he continues to be my favorite one. And when Bart Allen took over, I thought that was fine as well. And then it just continued, and now the Flash family has grown and changed as comic books continue. And now the Flash family includes a new Flash who's part of the Justice League of China, which is quite astounding to me. And I think that's amazing because it allows, like she said, the new creators that are able to represent properly these cultures and races to, bring out these stories, like for new people to leave their mark on classic characters. And I think that's great. And as the child of two immigrants, my mother from Mexico and my father from El Salvador, it's really inspiring to know that I can one day do something like that. Knowing that, for example, Blue Beetle, the Blue Beetle is Jaime Reyes, and it still incorporates Ted Kord, keeps that legacy there, which is nice, and which is what people are familiar with, and I feel like is able to ease readers back into it for me. And I think that's a wonderful thing.
And so getting back to, I guess, Andy's original question, and one of the things you did to preface your question to everyone was to bring in the age issue, right? So if this is a property that you enjoyed at a certain age and then it is changed a number of years later, you may be grumbling a little bit because that's not the Three Musketeers, or that's not the Black Panther, or that's not the Superman that you remember. It's interesting in that I immediately thought of a film example, not a comic book example, but Superman. Because when we got, 1978, the Christopher Reeve Superman, and that was my Superman. But the Superman before that was George Reeves, which I used to see in reruns as a kid. I'm not that old, during the original run, but I remember seeing it on TV. And then a few years ago, we got Man of Steel, which is very different from the 1970 Superman film. And even though I may not enjoy the most recent manifestation of Superman in film now, that's okay because it's not necessarily for me. And I'm in a different place that I was back in the late 1970s. And that really caught me, that film. Being someone very much influenced by, the Star Wars, Close Encounters, Jaws, those kind of big blockbusters of the 70s. This was just a continuation of that blockbuster-dom in Raiders of the Lost Ark. And so that, that's has a special place in my heart. So the new Superman, Man of Steel, didn't really do much for me. Plus, it was just... It was made for 3D, and I don't like 3D films. So.
and I'm one of the few people that loved the one that came in the middle. So I thought Superman Returns was wonderful, and I'll fight anybody with it.
I agree with you on that.
Yeah.
Quentin Tarantino loved it a lot, too, actually, and has always promised an essay defending that film. Drags a little bit in the middle, but I think there's some fabulous parts of it.
I almost cried when he returns. But I believe the point is another Superman will be coming down the pike in probably 5 years, which is fine, or isn't.
Yeah.
Although one sort of... I'm sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead. Oh, okay. I think it also kind of depends on how they choose to reiterate the character, because I know personally, I am a huge fan of the original Teen Titans cartoon that they had airing on Cartoon Network. I absolutely loved that show and some of the really deep themes that it incorporated. And I have very strong negative feelings towards Teen Titans Go, but it's not made for me. So I feel like a lot of it lies in how you are portraying the characters and what age group you are portraying them for, because the Teen Titans that they have on TV right now, they're not made for a more mature audience, and they don't explore those more mature themes. It's very much kind of kitted down. So I think that definitely needs to play a part.
Now, I'm just going to bring up one sort of case study that we've talked about in class a few times. In the challenges of reinterpreting characters, and creators and publishers have to walk a fine line between pleasing that audience that's been following those characters for years, or shall we say in the case of some people who will remain nameless, decades, but also trying to reach new audiences. And I think the case study here is the controversy that flared up within the last year when some marketing executive at Marvel, meeting with retailers and hearing the complaints from retailers about too many titles and falling sales, and the marketing executive pointed the finger at trying to create new versions of the characters like the Jane Foster Thor, and saying, well, we've gone too far in the direction of diversity there. So I think this is going to be an ongoing tug of war, and I think that's a perfect case study of the challenges of trying to tell stories for an audience that has followed the characters and the titles for a long, long time, and trying to reach out to new readers as well. And that's one of the formal challenges, I think, of working in this mainstream media.
You know, along with that, it reminded me of something else in terms of the changing of the guard, so to speak, in terms of the way that a particular comic book character is written and drawn, given a certain backstory. At what point does the change because of marketing overshadow a more substantive reason or reasons for changing a character's backstory and the creative team surrounding that? I mean, I don't have an easy answer for that, but one of the things that I think, going back to Andy's original question about the constant rebooting, is when there is, at least for me, a clear marketing reason why they're doing that. A new number one. Several decades ago, a number one demonstrated that, or suggested that a title written really hadn't paid its dues. And so do you want to go with an unproven text? Whereas if an issue was at 357, it's been around for a while, so you are relatively safe. But now the constant rebooting with number ones, but along with that, the rebooting of the character. So, for instance, when Jane Foster several years ago became the new Thor, on the one hand, to me, I don't read Thor, granted. That sounded exciting to me, but on the other hand, the cynical part of me wondered, are they doing this for sales? Are they doing this just to get new readers? And I'm not saying that that's necessarily a bad thing, but it's just a matter of degree. At what point does the, if I can put it this way, money grubbing overshadow the rest of the intention?
Can I throw in one thing quick about that?
I got something too.
No, go for it. I'm smoking already.
All right. Okay. Zig here. Yeah, I get you. Sometimes it's about the money grubbing, because let's face it, the first responsibility of Marvel Corporation is to make a profit. But what they do when they do it really well is tell a great story. And the Jane Foster story arc of her becoming Thor, of her being a chemotherapy patient and losing her powers when she becomes Thor, but she needs to become Thor to fulfill her responsibilities to basically the 9 realms as war begins to engulf everything, is utterly brilliant. I mean, you were talking Shakespeare. Applause. I love that. The absolute favorite author ever. That is Shakespearean in its depth. So, yeah, undoubtedly they wanted to make a buck. Who doesn't? Okay. As Samuel Johnson once said, nobody but an idiot ever wrote for money. But except to get money. And I think that just the Thor arc is just, whatever cynicism you might have, I think it's paid itself off.
And granted, I'm not necessarily cynical about the Thor change from a few years ago. And I use that just as an example because, Mike, you brought this up. But I think it's a kind of a general cynicism. I mean, for instance, if there's no reason to reboot a character or even a series, like, what was it, a few years ago, they rebooted Daredevil, that there was no change to the creative team. Basically, the character went from, New York to the West Coast. And they started in number one. You know why they did it? In order to sell more copies. What the cynical part of me is wondering about is when this kind of imposed change by the publisher takes place, how much of it is motivated by money? And I agree with you. It comes right down to the fact that it's a business. And of course they have to sell. If we want to continue reading the comics, the good stuff as well as the not so good stuff, things have to sell. So I know that has to be the case. But at what point might those concerns overshadow more substantive decisions that could actually have more of a prolonged impact on down the road in terms of, storytelling, satisfaction of getting an issue every month, so on and so forth?
All right, I'm going to go for one more big question. Right, I'm sorry about the preface, but if you guys can bear with me for a minute on this. Okay. When I first heard about Jane Foster's Thor, all I could do was go back to one of the great issues of all time. I think it's 138 or something like this. And it was a great issue. This was way back in the 60s. Thor talks Odin into making Jane Foster a goddess so he could marry her. And she totally cracked it. It had nothing to do with her being a woman. It had to do with her being a human. She just couldn't do it. She said, I'm out of here, and boy, she was out of the comic. So the point is, me now being that age, that was my first reaction was, they did that. They already did. No, they did it in one issue 55 years ago, and yet I still have it in my mind as being, it's already been done. The other thing, I believe the elephant in the room that's not being spoken about, and I don't know if you covered it here, is, of course, Watchmen. Watchmen is I don't know if you guys have had to read it, but it's a real touchstone book. It's really essential reading. And now they've gone off and they've continued it on. And a lot of people are sitting there going, oh my God, it's so terrible what they're doing to all this, what they're doing to all that. You don't have to read it. At least that's the way I'm looking at it. And I'm asking you guys, do you guys have you guys talked at all about Watchmen? And is that also part of it? Is what I'm asking you? It's not necessarily the publishers looking for a buck? Is it also the readers who have been conditioned by continuity, even if the continuity reboots?
Or in the case of Alan Moore, a dedication to the original to the point that anything that smacks of other than Alan Moore is verboten.
Then again, do you want the further adventures of Hamlet?
Mm-hmm.
Well, Hamlet too.
Well, and of course, those things do exist. I mean, I think you can look at the example of Sherlock Holmes. I mean, how many different creators, whether in ways recognized by the Arthur Conan Doyle estate or not, have added new stories to that. And I don't want to use the word canon because some are canonical and some are not. So I think there is a precedent for this. As we look at all of these things, whether it's DC making the decision, I think a bad one, to create a sequel to Watchmen, or whether Marvel, going with the storyline of Jane Foster becoming a version of Thor, which I think is a very clever and very well realized storyline, one that also has a great awareness of all of the decades of history of those characters. In the case of a sequel to Watchmen, however, Doomsday Clock is kind of an interesting superhero story, but as something that is been created as a self-conscious imitation of a work that is so successful, not entirely, but so successful on its own terms, it's like karaoke Watchmen. It's not the real thing. It's an imitation of that.
And that's going to be the new title of an upcoming DC series, I'm sure. Karaoke Watchmen.
I get some of the rights for that. Absolutely. And I think that fails. All of these things are driven by commercial forces, ultimately. And I think one of the challenges of the popular medium is what talented creators can do within those constraints. And sometimes they can come up with really interesting and original things, and sometimes it just ends up being a product that's churned out to hopefully earn some more money for the publisher.
But does it mar the original?
No.
It's the question.
No. And by the way, Richard Lester's version of the Three Musketeers and the Four Musketeers is the best one, with Michael York and Oliver Reed, and Frank Finlay and Christopher Lee.
Raquel Welch and Faye Dunaway.
Raquel Welch, Charlton Heston. Yeah, so we got to get that in. Written by George MacDonald Fraser of the Flashman books, just to get in the weeds further here.
Well, the Watchmen example is interesting because, earlier we were talking about market forces and money grubbing from Marvel's perspective. I think a lot of people see that, or could argue that that's what DC over the past several years has been doing increasingly with the Watchmen property. Trying to, most recently fold it more securely into the DC universe. But even before that, when we had that series from several years ago, about 6 or 7 now, before Watchmen, how much of that could one say is an attempted money grubbing?
All of it.
All of it. So my assumption is you're not a fan. You weren't a fan of any of those titles.
I thought actually some of the before Watchmen titles were interesting. There were a couple done by Darwin Cook. Yeah, sure. Darwin Cook, I think, is great creator who died prematurely. And I think he was doing some interesting things. That does not mar the original. On the other hand, I kind of wish Darwin Cook had chosen another series to do. But that's just me.
And yet, he also took on The Spirit, which... Sorry, this is probably driving these guys crazy. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I want to hear the students talk more.
I
Chase one.
And we just scared one away.
I think you have to answer the phone.
Well, for me, I read the Watchmen series when I was a lot younger, and I thought it was really great. And I read very much into it, and I learned a lot from it, and spoke to different people that have shed more light on some of the deeper themes in the Watchmen series. And it's one of my favorite series. I enjoy it a great deal. And when Doomsday Clock was announced, I wasn't sure how to feel at first, but I quickly got excited, mainly because it wasn't because I felt like the original was being tarnished, but because I'm still essentially a kid. I felt like, these two properties that I very much loved were coming together in a way that I did not think about. And rereading some of the older DC titles, well, they're not older, but some that came out in the previous years, how they've been hinting towards something this, and I don't want to use the phrase monumental, but monumental, coming now. Doomsday Clock, I've been reading and follow closely, and I think it's a lot of fun, mainly because it's sort of this continuation, but it doesn't have to be if you don't want it to be, essentially. If you want to view Watchmen as its own thing, then you can, and then if you want to continue it, then you can. And I think that's such a great thing because it allows these writers to tackle a property that they thought maybe they'd never be able to write for or to write about. And I think that's one of the great things about the comic book industry, because that allows people to do characters maybe outside of continuity or within continuity, but to do it their way. And that's a big reason why, although it might be money grubbing in some way, I enjoy DC's Earth 1 line, because it allows these writers to write for a character that they never thought they could write for. And they might not be able to in continuity, but they have these Earth 1 books so that there can be a new version of this character and people can choose to read that one or not to. And I think that's a great thing for writers everywhere.
I'm glad you mentioned the Earth 1 series. It's rather opportune, I guess, because just this morning I was thinking, I really need to catch up with the Earth 1 titles. I'm way behind, and then here you bring it up.
Too. I've read all of the Earth 1 Supermans, and I thought they were a lot of fun. They were great stories, I felt like. That, are a new spin on Clark Kent, Kal-El.
Yeah. You read the Green Lantern?
I have not yet. I'm
Yes,
looking forward
because
to
in
it.
fact, I think that thought occurred to me today because I was listening to another podcast where someone was talking about Earth One Green Lantern, and they were really loving it.
Yeah. And I mean, it's stuff like this. It's the Elseworld titles from DC that I think are fun because although they aren't incorporated into like the multiverse and main continuity type thing, it allows people that may not be familiar with comics to kind of pick this up and say, this is something that I can get into, and maybe it's a new way for them to get into comics and to go into this big history of superheroes.
Well, let me ask you guys here who have been taking this class. Did you read, and maybe, Mike, you told me this and I can't remember the answer. Did you read anything other than, let's say, mainstream comics or licensed properties? In other words, titles that were creator-owned, that were maybe just one and done and that's it. What one might call a graphic novel.
Okay, it's not a quiz now. We did.
Yeah,
Remembers.
I mean, we read Mouse by Art Spiegelman, and I had read it previously before the class, so I was very happy to be able to revisit it. And I've read other graphic novels that have, I can't remember the name of one of them, but we talked about it, Dr. Kobre, about the sort of Chinese history in graphic novel form. There's
one
two
of
accompanying
Gene Lewin Yang's books.
I believe so.
Boxer and Saints? Or American-Born Chinese?
I think that one.
Okay.
Yes. And it was they're great because it's something that I've actually thought about doing and I was inspired to do, and I've written a great deal for a sort of history on my parents coming to America because they have, I feel, an interesting story that people might be interested in. And I think it's this really great way of bringing up these stories that you might otherwise only hear from a person when you're talking to them and asking them about their history. And it allows writers to bring up issues that they feel are important.
Mm-hmm. Because those kind of works are out of the realm of, let's say, Andy, your earlier question, asking revamping of properties or another twist or another interpretation of a particular character or, universe or, superhero world. Because when you have creator-owned stuff, they create things from the ground up, whether that be fantastical or whether it be more realistic in nature. And American-Born Chinese is a great example of something that is more realistic and quite fantastical.
Right.
We also did a Contract with God with Will Eisner, just looking at the evolution of the form as well. Not the first graphic novel, but close to it. And
Can I
yes,
get a question in?
Of course, yes. Zig?
I've got to say, thank you. Okay, got a question for the students. I think fundamentally, you used the phrase "you're a kid" a little while ago. Suddenly you're a kid again. At their core, comic books are about kid-like fun. Mm-hmm. Each of you, please. What's the most fun you've discovered in this class?
That's a good question.
For me personally, I would probably say just the overall creativity of comic books. Like we were talking about earlier when we were talking about being in the weeds. I still can't say the name of the mist that we were talking about, but I find it fascinating that there's so many different plot lines for every story, and Ben and I constantly talk about how, because I had no idea that there were different lines of Spider-Man. Like, I was like, what? There's more than one? And he was like, there's different universes. And I was like, this is insane. What? How do you keep up with this? So for me, just through the class, it was learning about just the writing and the art of comic books, personally.
Wait until you try to keep up with the Avengers title.
She's right. Oh, yeah. That's why I don't touch Avengers.
There's 700,000 Avengers.
And you sell all of them, right? That was Carla. If the mic picked her up, I think it did.
I know for me, a lot of the joy has come from like seeing how this comic has evolved, but into different forms, like what is called a graphic novel, and how it can take up different themes outside of the superhero narrative. Like we talked about in class, how once the superhero narrative started to go down after World War, was it 1 or 2? Two. We saw the advent of mystery comic books, horror comic books, romance comic books, westerns. And I like the idea of that reaching out beyond just the general superhero narrative, where more stories can be told through this visual media form. And so I really just liked the idea of that and how that kind of expanded universe.
Yeah.
So, thank you. You're so nice. As a new-ish comic books reader, I've and it was something that we had talked about, you guys were talking about earlier, when you come at it and you realize that there's so many titles, it can be overwhelming, but what I've really enjoyed is finding series that I like, but then also finding the connections between them. So even if I'm not reading every single version or iteration or reboot or series, I like learning, like kind of when we were going in the weeds today, learning the little details that then start to link, and then going to the movies and finding out things, or, essentially just kind of like nerding out and finding the connections. Like I just really enjoy that, which then, even though it's overwhelming to kind of jump into comics as a new reader when it's existed for decades and decades and decades, I can find what I like and then branch off from there. Like I'll find 8 different things that I can branch off with and go and find that and read that and find the history. So I don't know. I just like discovering the new titles and the histories and all that. So anyone?
Any other joyous recollections from this past semester?
Watching his passion. Like he gets really into it and knows so much, and it's so fun and fascinating.
Okay, that's it.
I'm not taking it for a grade.
That's why I give you the A.
I mean, I think it's just fun to be able to talk in a very academic sense about something that I've been passionate about since I was 6 years old. I mean, it's just a lot of fun. I get to revisit a lot of different things that I never thought I'd be able to in a classroom setting, and to be able to finally talk about these deeper themes and subjects in class because they are there and because they're very, I feel as though they're important to talk about. I think that's the most fun I've had in a class in quite a while, honestly.
I will have to say that it's been a great class. It's been a lot of fun to teach. I was remembering, though, as I was coming to the store this evening, and I was talking with Ben and Juliana about what I consider to be one of the greatest teaching moments in my career, and I will share this. When I was teaching a class on comics several years ago, and you have that moment before class begins, and everybody's sitting in the classroom, and, I'm shuffling papers, and students have their books, and a student in the back row had a Shakespeare textbook out for a Shakespeare class later. Always wanted to do this. And I said to him, Evan, what are you reading in class? Is that Shakespeare? You put that Shakespeare away right now and take out your comic book. That was the teaching moment that I've been waiting for all my life.
Now, what if he had one of, let's say, the adaptations from Classics Illustrated of a Shakespearean play?
Classics Illustrated would be okay. I think there's some other sort of watered-down versions of Shakespeare that would not be accepted. So, you have to have standards somehow.
Well, I want to thank you guys for coming into the well, I know you had to come into the shop for your class, but you didn't have to sit down and share your thoughts and experiences about this past semester with Professor Kobre. So I really do appreciate you talking with me and with everyone else. And then everyone, in fact, now this is a audio medium, not visual, but for our listeners right now, imagine a variety of people, and we've had a lot still, who are standing around the table when a seat's not available, and sometimes, like Andy or Zig, they'll jump in with a question and then back out. But yeah, we have had not only many participants, but a ready-made audience around the table. So I want to thank everyone for being here, and I will be back next month for another On Location episode. And if you want to find out more about what we do on our On Location shows or otherwise on the Comics Alternative, then definitely check us out. You can go to our website, comicsalternative.com, and there you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe, or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up your telephone and dialing 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427. You can also email the show. We're 2guys@comicsalternative.com, or you can email me directly. I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com. And you can find us all over social media. My God, we're everywhere. We're on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, Slack, and Discord. You can subscribe to this podcast through Apple Podcasts. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on Spotify, on TuneIn, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, comicsalternative.com. Everyone, thank you very much. It's been a lively conversation. Thanks.